My name is Alex Sterling. I hold a Master of Library and Information Science with a specialization in archival studies from Simmons University. It is with a mind trained in the principles of provenance, order, and the verifiable truth of the written record that I offer this account. I do not expect it to be cataloged, preserved, or even believed. I am writing it down because the alternative, to let it remain solely in my memory, is a sentence I can no longer endure. Last summer, I accepted a seasonal position as a fire lookout for the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. The posting was for the Mount Graves Fire Tower, a remote outpost in the dense wilderness of the Berkshires. To my employers, my qualifications were perhaps peculiar. A scholar of decaying manuscripts seeking a post traditionally held by seasoned outdoorsmen or solitary eccentrics. But for me, the logic was sound. I was in the final, grueling stages of my doctoral dissertation on the preservation of ephemeral media. The stipend was modest, but the promise of uninterrupted solitude was priceless. I sought isolation as a cure, a quiet place to wrestle my footnotes into submission, and, if I am to be entirely honest, to recover from the quiet collapse of a relationship that had defined my adult life. I craved a silence deep enough to drown out the echoes of my own failure. The journey to the tower was the first lesson in true remoteness. After an hour on a paved road that narrowed into a gravel track, my departmental contact, a woman named Maria whose voice I would come to know only through a speaker, met me at a locked gate. From there, it was another 40 minutes in a state-owned pickup truck, grinding up a path that was more of a scar on the mountainside than a road. The tower itself was a stark, skeletal structure of steel, perched atop the highest point for miles, with a single 14 by 14 foot room, the cab, at its apex, 100 feet above the ground. It was a glass-walled cage suspended between the forest and the sky. Maria gave me the tour, which took all of 5 minutes. It was a Spartan existence: a cot, a small desk, a propane stove, and the room's centerpiece, an Osborne fire fender, a large brass and steel disc with sighting apertures for pinpointing the location of smoke. Your predecessor, Frank, left in a bit of a hurry, she said, her tone flat and uncurious. Didn't clean up much. She pointed to a stack of dusty paperbacks and a half-empty tin of coffee. Radio check. Ins are at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Report any smoke, nothing else. The radio is for official business only. Conserve your battery and your privacy. She left me with a final, lingering look that I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity, but something closer to appraisal, as if she were measuring me against a standard I didn't understand. Then she was gone, and the sound of her truck faded, swallowed by the immense, waiting silence. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. I fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the static-laced crackle of the radio. My world shrank to the confines of the cab and the 360-degree panorama of rolling green hills that stretched to every horizon. The silence was profound, a physical presence that pressed in on the glass walls. At first, it was peaceful. I wrote. I read. I watched the slow drift of clouds. But isolation, as I was learning, is not a passive state. It is an active force that works on the mind. Deprived of its usual diet of ambient noise and human interaction, my brain began to create its own stimuli. The wind whistling through the steel struts of the tower began to sound like a whisper. The rustle of a squirrel in the leaves below became a footstep. I would find myself holding my breath, listening for a sound that was never there. I was an archivist, a person who deals in facts, yet my own senses were becoming unreliable sources. I felt a growing sense of insignificance, of being a forgotten speck in a vast, uncaring wilderness, a feeling that I was invisible, forgotten, and ultimately expendable. This was the internal carnage that solitude promised. A slow unraveling of the self long before any external threat had made itself known. It was on the 5th day, during a bout of cleaning, motivated by a desire to impose some order, my increasingly disordered thoughts, that I found the document tucked inside the back cover of an old, leather-bound logbook in the desk drawer was a single sheet of yellowed paper. It was typed, the letters faint and slightly misaligned, the product of an old manual typewriter. The logbook itself contained sparse entries from Frank, weather observations, notes on wildlife, the mundane chronicles of his watch. But the last few pages were torn out. Only this single, loose sheet remained. I smoothed it out on the desk. It was a list of rules. My first reaction was one of academic curiosity. It was a found artifact, a primary source document, detailing the private rituals of my predecessor. I saw it as a sad but fascinating record of a mind succumbing to cabin fever, a classic case of isolation-induced paranoia. I, with my academic detachment and psychological self-awareness, would not make the same mistakes. I read the list, a faint, condescending smile on my lips. Table 1 rules for a quiet season at Mount Graves, Lookout 1. The radio is for reporting smoke only. Personal chatter is discouraged. They listen. You will sometimes see a man walking the ridge at dusk. He is not lost. Do not hail him. 3. Keep a salt shaker on the western windowsill. It doesn't matter if it's full. 4. If you hear knocking on the trapdoor in a 3-3-3 rhythm, ignore it. If the rhythm changes, hide under the desk until sunrise. 5. Do not look at your reflection in the windows after dark. It is not always your own. 6. Some nights the stars will be wrong. On these nights, do not use any lights. Rely on the moon. 7. Do not acknowledge the music between 300 and 3:15 a.m. It is not for you. 8. If you smell something sweet, like rotting flowers, go to the center of the room and do not look out the windows for 1 hour. 9. If you see a fire that isn't there, report it on the log. Do not report it on the radio. You don't want to bother them. 10. Never leave the tower between sunset and sunrise. What moves in the dark is quick, and it is hungry. 11. If Maria's voice on the radio sounds too calm, it is not Maria. Give a false report and sign off. 12. Do not let the lamp oil run out. Ever. I chuckled a dry, lonely sound in the quiet cab. It was a perfect encapsulation of a psyche under duress. The listening, they. On the radio, the phantom hiker. The superstitions about salt and reflections. It was all textbook. The rules were not a warning, they were a diagnosis. I folded the paper neatly and tucked it back into the logbook, a curious artifact for my collection. I was a rational man, a scholar. I would not be governed by the delusions of my predecessor. I was safe. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the glass in its frames. It sounded for a moment almost like knocking. But I knew what it was. It was just the wind. For the next week, my life was a study in determined normalcy. I treated Frank's list of rules as a psychological artifact, a case study in how solitude can curdle the mind. My academic training provided a comforting framework. I was not the subject of this strange narrative, but its analyst. The knocking sound I'd heard was, upon sober morning reflection, clearly the steel frame of the tower contracting in the sudden night chill. The wind, funneled through the struts, could produce a wide range of percussive effects. It was simple physics. I annotated my dissertation, cross-referenced my sources, and felt the familiar, grounding weight of verifiable fact settle over me. The world was an orderly place, governed by principles I could understand. The wilderness was vast and indifferent, not malicious. My routine was my shield. 8 a.m. radio check-in. Hours of writing, punctuated by methodical scans of the horizon with my binoculars. Lunch. More writing. An evening walk around the tower's narrow catwalk before sunset. 8 p.m. radio check-in. Then, reading until my eyes grew heavy. It was a monastic existence, and for a time it worked. The silence became peaceful again, the isolation productive. I was convincing myself that I was immune to kind of mental decay that had so obviously claimed my predecessor. The first crack in my carefully constructed reality appeared on a Tuesday. It was dusk, that liminal hour when the world is painted in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. I was on the catwalk, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the sun bleed out behind the western ridges. And then I saw him, a figure, walking along the spine of the opposite ridge, perhaps 2 miles distant. My first thought was relief. Another human being. But something was wrong. He wasn't hiking in the recreational sense. There was no jaunty stride, no pause to admire the view. He moved with a slow, metronomic pace, a black silhouette against the fading light. I retrieved my binoculars from inside the cab, my hands surprisingly steady. I focused them on the figure. He was just a man dressed in dark clothing. He carried no pack, no walking stick. He simply walked, his head down, following the curve of the earth, as if tracing a line only he could see. He never stumbled. He never stopped. He was heading north, away from any known trail or access road. As the last of the light died, he was swallowed by the growing darkness. I lowered the binoculars, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Rule Fight 2 swam up from my memory. You will sometimes see a man walking the ridge at dusk. He is not lost. Do not hail him. Just a local, I said aloud, the sound of my own voice startlingly thin in the open air. Someone who knows the mountains. But the explanation felt hollow. Why walk there? Where could he possibly be going? The rule implied a recurrence, a pattern. The thought that this was a regular pilgrimage to nowhere was far more disturbing than the idea of a man being lost. I felt a sudden, intense sensation of being watched. a primal instinct that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I scanned the sea of trees below, but there was nothing but deepening shadow. I retreated into the glass cab, the lock on the trapdoor clicking shut with a sound of finality. 2 nights later, the smell came. I was at my desk, trying to untangle a particularly thorny citation, when it drifted in through the open windows. It was cloying, sickly sweet. The smell of flowers, but flowers that had been left to die and decay, in a vase of stagnant water. It was the smell of a funeral home, a scent both floral and corrupt. Rule Pide 80. If you smell something sweet, like rotting flowers, go to the center of the room and do not look out the windows for 1 hour. My scientific mind rebelled. It had to be a natural phenomenon. Patch of night, blooming plant I wasn't familiar with. A dead animal upwind. Its scent mingling with the pines to create this bizarre perfume. I stood up, determined to locate the source, to apply logic and observation. I walked to the eastern window, the smell growing stronger. I peered out into the moonless dark, seeing nothing. I moved to the southern window, then the western. The smell was everywhere, pressing in from all sides. A suffocating blanket of sweet decay. A wave of nausea washed over me. My academic curiosity was rapidly being replaced by a more primitive, animal urge to hide. The rule's instruction was absurd. Go to the center of the room.
Don't look.
Why, what was there to see? Yet my body was already obeying. I found myself backing away from the glass walls, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't consciously decide to follow the rule. It felt more like an instinctual retreat from an unseen predator. I dragged my chair to the exact center of the cab, the point where the Osborne fire finder was bolted to the floor. I sat down, facing the trapdoor, my back to all 4 walls of glass. I was a scholar, a man of reason, hiding in the middle of a room because a madman's note told me to. The absurdity of it was almost enough to make me laugh, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by fear. The smell was thick, almost tangible. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on the sound of my own breathing. I did not look. I did not move. I waited for the hour to pass, a prisoner in my own head, while outside, in the darkness I was forbidden to witness, something was happening. When the smell finally, gradually, dissipated, leaving only the clean scent of pine, the relief was so profound it left me weak and trembling. My carefully maintained scholarly detachment was gone, shattered. I was no longer analyzing Frank's paranoia. I was living it. The world had ceased to be an orderly, rational place. It was now governed by a set of arbitrary, terrifying laws I didn't understand. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I did my work, I made my radio calls, but it was all mechanical. My real focus was on the list. I read it over and over, my condescending amusement replaced by the frantic attention of a student cramming for an exam on which his life depended. The final test came on a Saturday night. A storm had rolled in, and the world outside the cab was a chaos of wind and rain. I was working late, the propane lamp casting a hissing, golden circle of light that kept the raging dark at bay. I felt a strange sense of security in the lamp's glow, a tiny bubble of warmth, and order amidst the storm. I stood up to stretch my back, and my gaze fell upon my reflection in the rain-streaked window pane. And it wasn't me. For a single, heart-stopping second, the face that stared back was not my own. It was gaunt, hollow-cheeked. The skin stretched tight over the skull. The eyes were wide with a terror so absolute it transcended any emotion I had ever known. The mouth was a black O of a silent, unending scream. It was a death mask. It was the face of a man who had seen the abyss. I cried out and stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, then forced them open again. I looked back at the window. There was only my own reflection. Pale and terrified, my features distorted by the rivulets of water on the glass. Alex Sterling. Just me. A hallucination. A trick of the light, the rain, the flickering lamp, the stress. My rational mind offered the explanation, but the words were a flimsy shield against the sheer, visceral horror of what I had seen. Rule 5A. Do not look at your reflection in the windows after dark. It is not always your own. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my cot, the lamp burning beside me. My back pressed against the solid interior wall that housed the cabinets, the only part of the room that wasn't glass. I did not sleep. I waited for the dawn as if waiting for a pardon. By the 8 p.m. radio call the next evening, I was a wreck. The storm had passed, but my own internal storm was still raging. I was jumpy, exhausted, and I felt a creeping dread about the simple act of picking up the radio. It felt like attracting attention. But missing a check-in was not an option. With a trembling hand, I keyed the microphone. Mount Graves to base, all clear. I said, my voice hoarse. The speaker crackled to life. Thank you, Mount Graves. It was Maria's voice, but it was wrong. All wrong. The usual wariness was gone. The faint static that always accompanied her transmissions was absent. Her voice was perfectly smooth, unnaturally calm, like the placid surface of a deep black lake. Al is quiet here as well. A very quiet night. Ice flooded my veins. My mind screamed. Rule fel l'endredi. If Maria's voice on the radio sounds too calm, it is not Maria. Give a false report and sign off. This wasn't a smell or a shadow. This was a voice, an interaction. It was real. My thoughts raced in a panic. What false report? My eyes darted to the list, still sitting on my desk. Rule 890. If you see a fire that isn't there, report it on the log. Do not report it on the radio. You don't want to bother them. So not a phantom fire. Something else. Something plausible. My mind, trained for archival recall, latched onto a detail from a map I'd been studying. Copy that base. I stammered, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I have a visual on an unauthorized campfire. Near the old quarry site, South Slope. Looks like a couple of kids. I'll monitor. Mount Graves, over. There was a silence on the other end. It stretched for 1 second. 2. 3. It was an eternity of pure, cold dread. Then the calm, serene voice returned, unchanged. Acknowledged, Mount Graves. Thank you for your vigilance. Base. Over. The radio clicked off. The silence that rushed back in was absolute and terrifying. I had followed the rule. I had lied to the thing on the radio, and now it knew where I was, and it knew that I knew. The click of the radio signing off was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a gunshot in the cathedral of silence I had once craved, and in its wake, a new kind of silence descended. This was not the peaceful, contemplative quiet of my first days here. This was a predatory silence, the held breath of a hunter that knows its prey is cornered. I had followed the rules. I had played the game. And in doing so, I had tipped my hand. The thing on the radio, the calm voice that wore Maria's identity like a mask, now knew that I was aware of the performance. The comforting illusion of my isolation being a simple, physical state was gone. I was not just alone, I was being watched. My solitude was a cage, and something was now rattling the bars. My academic mind, the part of me that still clung to reason, tried to reassert control. It was a prank, a local legend, perpetuated by the other lookouts to haze the new guy. Maria's voice was distorted by a bad connection. The list was a joke, but the explanations were thin, pathetic whispers against the roaring certainty in my gut. The face in the window, the smell of rot, the silent man on the ridge. These were not jokes, they were data points, and they all pointed to a conclusion my sanity refused to accept. I was no longer an archivist studying a strange document. I was the subject of the text, a character trapped in a narrative whose I was only just beginning to comprehend. I spent the rest of the night in a state of vigilant terror. Every gust of wind against the glass was a hand testing the panes. Every creak of the steel frame was a footstep on the stairs. I left the propane lamp burning, its gentle hiss a fragile shield against the oppressive darkness outside. I didn't dare look at my reflection again. I sat on the floor, my back against the solid wooden cabinets. The list of rules spread on the floor before me like a sacred text. I was a scholar who had spent his life believing in the power of the written word, and now my life depended on a single, typed page of a madman's prose. Sleep was impossible. I drifted in and out of a feverish state of near consciousness, my mind a maelstrom of fear and fragmented academic theories on paranoia and psychological collapse. But this was not a collapse. This was a clarification. The world was not what I thought it was. The knocking started just after 2 a.m. Thump. Thump. A pause. Thump. 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 It came from directly below me. From the trapdoor that was my only way in or out. It was a heavy, solid sound like someone striking the thick wood with the heel of their palm. It was rhythmic. Precise. 3-3-3. Rule Wine 4. If you hear knocking on the trapdoor in a 3-3-3 rhythm, ignore it. If the rhythm changes, hide under the desk until sunrise. My blood ran cold. My breath hitched in my chest. Ignore it. The instruction was simple, yet it felt like the most difficult task I had ever been assigned. Every instinct screamed at me to react. To shout, to look, to arm myself with the fire extinguisher. But the list, my only lifeline, was clear. Ignore it. So I did. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my hands over my ears. But the sound was not just something I heard. It was a vibration I felt through the floorboards, a pulse that resonated deep in my bones. I tried to hum, to recite the Dewey Decimal classifications, to do anything to drown it out. But the knocking was relentless, a patient, methodical summons from the abyss below my feet. Thump, thump. An hour passed, or maybe it was a minute. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the sound, and my desperate, silent refusal to acknowledge it. My carefully constructed identity as Alex, PhD, candidate, was being systematically dismantled. I was becoming a creature of pure instinct, a terrified animal hiding in its burrow. And then the rhythm changed. Thump, 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 thump. The change was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The patient, even beat was gone, replaced by something more urgent, more hungry. Thump, 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 thump. My mind went blank with a terror so absolute it was almost serene. The rule was explicit. The condition had been met. If the rhythm changes, hide under the desk until sunrise. I didn't think. I scrambled on all fours. Crab. Walking across the floor to the small wooden desk, where I had been writing my dissertation on the preservation of truth. The irony was a bitter acid in my throat. I squeezed myself into the small space beneath it, pulling my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was an active, listening silence. I could feel it, a palpable pressure against the tower. I held my breath, straining to hear. A faint scratching sound started at the edges of the trapdoor. The sound of a fingernail, or a claw, testing the seams. Then, a low, guttural whisper, the words indistinct, but the wireless perfectly clear. It was a sound that did not belong to any human throat. I stayed under that desk for what felt like a lifetime. I watched the faint line of gray light appear under the eastern windows, heralding the dawn. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. Only when the first rays of direct sunlight struck the floor of the cab did I dare to move. My limbs were stiff, my body racked with shivers. I crawled out from under the desk and stood, shakily, in the center of the room. I was alive. I had survived the night by obeying the rules. The next day was a hollow, gray affair. I performed my duties in a fog of exhaustion and dread. The 8 a.m. radio check-in was with the real Maria. Her voice was tired, crackling with static, and blessedly, beautifully normal. I almost wept with relief. But the relief was fleeting. The sun offered no real safety, only a temporary reprieve. The rules governed the night, and the night would come again. That evening, as the sun began to set, I felt a new kind of dread. I looked out the western window, not at the ridge, but up at the sky. As the last vestiges of blue faded to indigo, the stars began to appear. And they were wrong. Rule Phase 6A, some nights, the stars will be wrong. On these nights, do not use any lights. Rely on the moon. I am an archivist, but my hobbies include amateur astronomy. I know the constellations of the Northern Hemisphere, as well as I know my own name. I know where Polaris should be, the familiar shape of the Big Dipper, the W of Cassiopeia. None of them were there. The sky was a chaotic jumble of alien constellations, glittering with a cold, malevolent light. The patterns were intricate, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. It was as if I were looking at the sky from a different planet, a world where all the familiar signposts of my reality had been erased. My hand went instinctively to the switch for the propane lamp, but the rule stopped me. Do not use any lights. My heart hammered. The cab was already sinking into deep shadow. The moon, a pale sliver, offered only the faintest illumination, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. To be trapped in a glass box 100 feet in the air is one thing. To be trapped in it in near, total darkness under a sky of wrong stars is another thing entirely. It was a violation of a fundamental law of the universe, a cosmic horror that dwarfed the localized terror of the knocking. I sat at my desk, my eyes wide in the gloom, trying to adjust. Every familiar object in the room became a strange, menacing shape. The firefinder was a squat, metallic idol. My coat on its hook was a hunched figure. Then, at precisely 300 a.m., the music started. Rule Point 7I. Do not acknowledge the music between 300 and 3:15 a.m. It is not for you. It drifted up from the forest below. Faint at first, then growing clearer. It was a melody played on a reedy instrument, like a flute or a pipe. But the notes were discordant, following a scale that grated on the ear. It was a thin, wheedling tune, both melancholic and deeply unsettling. It spoke of ancient things, of deep woods and dark rituals. It was a song that no human was ever meant to hear. My first impulse was to cover my ears, but the rule was specific. Do not acknowledge the music. Covering my ears was an acknowledgement. It was an admission that I could hear it. So I sat there, rigid in my chair, my hands clenched into fists on the desk. I stared straight ahead into the darkness, forcing my expression to remain neutral. I let the alien melody wash over me, a tide of auditory wrongness. It felt like a test, a lure. The music was an invitation to something, and I knew with every fiber of my being that accepting it would mean the end of me. The 15 minutes stretched into an eternity. The piping seemed to worm its way inside my skull, trying to find a purchase to make me hum along. I focused on the grain of the wooden desk, visible in the faint moonlight. I traced it with my eyes, grounding myself in the physical world, refusing to be drawn into the song. At 3:15 a.m., it stopped, abruptly. The silence that returned was a blessing. When the sun finally rose on a sky that was, thankfully, familiar again, I knew that any lingering shred of my old self was gone. I was no longer a scholar seeking solitude. I was a prisoner, a subject of forces I could not comprehend, armed only with a list of cryptic instructions. My dissertation lay on the desk, a relic from another life. The only text that mattered now was the yellowed sheet of paper. My hands shaking, I took a pen and uncapped it. I needed to understand, to order the chaos. I began to make my own annotations on the sheet, my neat, academic script looking jarringly out of place next to the faint, typewritten letters. Next to Rule 84, I wrote auditory and tactile. Direct threat. Hiding is the only defense. Next to Rule 500, mimicry. Psychological. Deception required. I was trying to build a threat model, to categorize the phenomena, to force it into a framework I could understand. But it was a futile gesture. As I looked over the list, my eyes fell on the last rule. the one I had paid little attention to before. Rule Fen Twi, do not let the lamp oil run out. Ever. A sudden, cold dread seized me. The lamp had been my only comfort during the night of knocking. I had let it burn for hours. On instinct, I went to the small cabinet where the spare cans of propane were kept. There were two. I picked one up. It was light. Empty. I picked up the second one. Also empty. I looked at the canister currently attached to the lamp. I had no idea how much was left. It could be full, or it could be running on fumes. And I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the next night would not be a night of wrong stars. It would be a night that required light. A night when the darkness itself would be the enemy. And my light was finite. The discovery of the empty propane canisters was not a moment of sudden, heart-stopping terror. It was worse. It was a cold, quiet, and absolute certainty of doom. The previous night's events, the phantom hiker, the spectral reflection, the knocking, the alien stars, the infernal music, were acute, violent assaults on my reality. But this was a logistical problem, a simple, mundane fact that carried the weight of an executioner's sentence. I was an archivist, a man who understood that the most important truths are often found in the driest of details. And the detail was this: my light was finite, and the darkness was not. Rule Fe 12I, do not let the lamp oil run out. Ever. It was the last rule on the list, the only one that was underlined. Frank, my predecessor, had not just written it, he had emphasized it. It was not a suggestion for comfort. It was a prerequisite for survival. My mind, stripped of its academic arrogance and honed by nights of pure fear, became ruthlessly pragmatic. I was no longer a scholar wrestling with footnotes. I was a creature trapped, and I had to assess the resources in my cage. I checked the canister attached to the lamp. It felt perilously light. How many hours did I have? 5, 3, 1. There was no way to know. The sun was setting, painting the sky in mocking strokes of orange and pink. A beautiful prelude to the horror it would abandon me to. I had two choices, each a violation of the fragile system that had kept me alive. I could stay, rationing the last of my light, and pray it was enough to last until sunrise. Or I could break Rule Fe 10. Never leave the tower between sunset and sunrise, and flee into the darkness that the rules themselves had taught me to fear. To stay was to be a sitting duck, waiting for the lamp to hiss its last, inviting whatever was kept at bay by its glow to come inside. To run was to abandon my only fortress and venture into the hunting ground of things that were quick, and it is hungry. The internal carnage of true isolation was complete. My mind was no longer my own worst enemy. It was my only tool. The decision was made for me by a simple, primal calculation. A stationary target is an easy kill. My only hope, however slim, was in movement. As the last sliver of sun vanished, I prepared. I stuffed the logbook, with Frank's list tucked safely inside, into my jacket. It was the most important document I had ever handled. I took my keys, a bottle of water, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The flashlight felt like a child's toy, a pathetic defense against what I knew was out there. I left my dissertation on the desk. It belonged to a world that no longer existed. I took one last look around the cab. The little glass box that had been my sanctuary and my prison. The propane lamp was still hissing, casting a warm, golden circle. I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. It was a decoy. A final, defiant beacon. I hoped it would buy me time. With my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I unlatched the trapdoor. The wind whistled up from below, a cold, predatory whisper. I swung my legs over the edge and began to climb down the steel stairs, my back to the fragile safety of the lamp. The 100-foot descent was a journey into a different world. The higher I had been, the more I could see. Now, with every step down, my world shrank, swallowed by the encroaching forest and the absolute blackness beneath the tree line. I was halfway down when I heard the first sound. A twig snapping in the woods to my left. Too heavy for a squirrel. Too deliberate for a deer. I froze, my hands clamped tight on the cold steel railing. I listened, every nerve ending screaming. Silence. I forced myself to keep moving faster now, my boots clanging on the metal steps. Then, another sound. A low growl from my right. A guttural vibration that seemed to come from the very earth. It was answered by a chittering sound from behind the tower. They were communicating. They knew I was outside. The rule wasn't a superstition, it was a tactical warning. What moves in the dark is quick, and it is hungry. My feet hit the concrete base of the tower, and I didn't hesitate. I switched on my flashlight and ran. The beam cut a weak, bouncing tunnel through the oppressive dark, illuminating the narrow, rutted path that led down the mountain. The forest on either side was a solid wall of black, a place of unseen things. I could feel their eyes on me, 1,000 points of malevolent pressure. I ran with the desperation of a prey animal, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. Behind me, I heard them. Not walking. Crashing through the underbrush with an unnatural speed. There was a chorus of clicks and whispers, a language of the hunt. They were flanking me, staying just inside the tree line, pacing me. The flashlight beam caught a flicker of movement. Something pale and long, limbed darting between the trees. It was impossibly tall, impossibly thin. Panic gave way to a strange, cold clarity. I was not going to make it. The gate was miles away. They were faster, stronger. This was how it ended. My life's work had been the study of preserved records, and I was about to become an unrecorded, unpreserved meal. Then, a light. Far down the mountain path, 2 points of light appeared, growing brighter. Headlights. A vehicle was coming up the mountain. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through me. But it was immediately followed by a wave of dread. Who would be coming up here, at this time of night? Was it help? Or was it another part of the trap? The vehicle, a familiar state-owned pickup, fishtailed around a curve, its tires spitting gravel. It screeched to a halt beside me. The passenger door flew open.
Get in.
Now, it was Maria. The real Maria. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't need a second invitation. I threw myself into the cab, slamming the door shut as she stomped on the accelerator. The truck shot forward, and in the red glow of the taillights, I saw it. A figure stepped out of the woods onto the path behind us. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs too long for its body, its skin the color of bone. Its head swiveled towards us, and even from that distance, I could see that its eyes glowed with a faint, internal light, like dying embers. It was not the man from the ridge. It was one of the things that had been hunting me. "Don't look back!" Maria screamed, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Jess, don't look back!" We careened down the mountain, the engine screaming in protest. "What was that? What's happening?" I gasped. My voice ragged. "It's the tower," she said, her words clipped and frantic. "There's something wrong with it, with that whole mountain. We don't know what it is. The list. Did you find the list?"
Yes. I followed it.
Frank did too. "For a while," she said, swerving to avoid a fallen branch. Then he got cocky. He ran out of fuel for the lamp and panicked. He radioed me, screaming. Broke the first rule. That's how they knew he was weak, how they knew he'd run. They almost got him. My blood ran cold. The voice on the radio, the calm one, "That wasn't me," she confirmed, her voice trembling. "It was a test, to see if you knew the rules. When you gave the false report about the campfire, you confirmed you knew the game. But you also bought yourself time. It drew their attention south, to the quarry. It gave me a window to come get you. It was the only reason you had a chance." We burst through the final stretch of trees and reached the locked gate. Maria fumbled with a key, her hands shaking, and swung it open. She drove through and locked it behind us, the heavy chain rattling with a sound of beautiful finality. We were on the paved road. We were safe. I looked back, up toward the peak of Mount Graves. For a moment, I could still see it, a tiny, solitary point of golden light. My lamp, a beacon in a sea of hostile darkness. And then, as I watched, it winked out. The last of the fuel was gone. The tower was dark. I am writing this now, months later, from the safety of a university library, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and binding glue. I never finished my dissertation. My academic pursuits feel trivial, the concerns of a man who has never had to look into the real, uncatalogued darkness. I have the logbook. It is my most prized possession and my greatest burden. It is a primary source document from a place that defies documentation. I survived because I followed the rules written by a madman. But I only escaped because I broke one of them. I live with that paradox every day. I am an archivist who has witnessed a truth that can never be archived. It can only be passed on. A whispered warning from one survivor to the next. And I am the new author of the list,